He's a renowned editorial and environmental portrait photographer. He has shot for the likes of National Geographic, New York Magazine, Wired Magazine, Apple, Airbnb, Squarespace, just to name a few. He's also the co-founder of Observers, which is a platform where he interviews visionaries in their and their takes on photobooks. With me today is one of those visionaries himself, and that is Wesley Verhoeve.
Because we're in black and white, you can't tell, but I'm blushing a little bit. That was a very nice intro. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, Wesley. Apart from one friend of mine, and his name is Ewan, and it's spelled E-U-O-N. You're the only other person I know that has somehow managed to have an Instagram handle with just their first name.
Oh, yeah.
What's your Instagram handle? It's Wesley.
And then it's always like, the answer is always like, wait, like just Wesley? I'm like, yeah, just at Wesley. But sometimes people will type in just Wesley, which would also be a pretty good one.
That's a good one too. I think Wesley just takes the cake, man. It's baller. It's just.
Yeah, I'm very pleased with it. And even years ago, I even was fortunate to buy the domain for my personal website for my portfolio, which is wesley.co. And that is even a bigger win for me because that, even though that's not as, often used in today's society, I just love having that short URL. It's very pleasing. We
could just stop there and just
we're done.
Hats off.
Really nice to meet you.
Look, man. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where the journey of photography and, in particular, film photography started for you.
Well, really early on, my father's a photographer, so I grew up just playing with my Legos underneath the desk of the dark room in my house. So in the red light. While my dad was agitating and dodging and burning. And that was just, in the attic of our house. And that's basically where the seed was planted. And then, of course, as I got older, I started going on photo walks with my dad. I used my first camera that I used was my dad's Canon AE1, which is still a great camera all these years later. And then, at some point, he bought me my own camera, which was the Praktika, which is an Eastern German camera. I had a strap that had and I still have the strap. It says Kodak on it, really huge. It's very cool. And so that's where it all started. And then before we started recording, we talked about the fact that we both have a background in music. And what happened for me is like as a child, I got really into photography through my dad's stuff. And then as a young, let's say teenager, I kind of abandoned photography in favor of music, which then became my career for a while. And then maybe about 10 years ago, I started, 9 years ago, I started shooting again for fun. And then maybe 5-6 years ago, I ended up segueing my career from music to photography.
Did you? Yeah. So you were a musician?
Yes. The first 10 years of living in New York City, I was a musician, a songwriter for television shows. I produced a bunch of albums. I worked at a big label. I worked at a small label. I started my own label. I managed artists. It was like the whole gamut in that 10-year period. Not all at the same time, of course, but that was a very substantial period of my life and a great time. I'm a collaborator at heart, but I do wish that I was already doing photography, even as a hobby then, because I met so many fascinating people who went on to do great things in music, and I could have been taking all these wonderful documentary pictures in the studio or any of that kind of stuff, but. Alas, it took a couple more years before I came back to photography, and I'm glad I did.
You talked about the beginnings of your journey and what gear you were using at that time, and obviously a Canon AE1, which I feel like is just the pathway for. I still shoot with my Canon AE1, and I love it.
It's a great camera.
It's just a robust, great, reliable SLR, and in regards to, I guess, shooting today and most of your works, I know that you do shoot with a Pentax, but what gear are you using now? Do you have an array, or have you kind of sort of kept it as minimal as possible?
Well, I've kept it minimal in the worst version of minimal, meaning I do have quite a few cameras, but I've managed to cut down to only one camera per type of camera. So I have 1.67, 1.66, 1.6 by 4.5, one type of 35 millimeter camera manual focus, one type of 35 millimeter autofocus. So like in each bracket, I have narrowed it down to one camera, but I have multiple copies of some of those cameras just to be able to have backups and stuff like that.
Cool.
Yeah, but my true love camera wise is the Pentax 672. That's my baby.
Can you share with us your 35 millimeter cameras?
Yeah. I shoot all of my 35 millimeter camera photos pretty much with the Pentax LX, which is a camera that I highly recommend people do not buy because it's a dramatic camera. I love it. But it's almost like an abusive relationship because they always break. I have 3 of them just to be able to keep 2 going at the same time. They need repairs quite often because they have certain electronics that are tricky after all these years because they're 40-year-old cameras. They have a mirror problem that is like where the mirror starts sticking, which that can be fixed, but it's like they're a dream and a nightmare of a camera. So I always tell people if they're curious about exploring Pentax 35 millimeter, just get an MX, which is not quite the same, but you can shoot all the same glass, and it's a great camera too.
Did you develop or go on a journey of understanding how to process and scan film, or have you kind of always left it to a film lab, or do you have a close relationship with a film lab?
Yes. Well, as a kid, I learned how to do all the stuff in the darkroom, including developing and dodging and burning and hand printing and all that kind of stuff. But these days I work with labs. So just to save the time and I think it's such a specific art form, doing developing and hand printing and even scanning. It's a real skill. And I've decided, and I'm lucky to be able to decide to leave that work to experts in that field and focus my energy on being the best photographer that I can be, not picking up those adjacent skills that are super important and impressive, but I'd rather work together with other people that know how to do that really well. I give pretty extensive notes to my labs in terms of how I want things to come out. And
is that based on color or contrast or
everything? Really, it's based on those two things, but it's also based on, I overexposed this.
Pushing. Please
Either like maybe I'm pulling in, maybe I'm pushing something, but I'm very specific. It could be like a third of a stop, or I'm very particular about how those kinds of things play out to kind of get the result that I want. But most of it is actually not so much about the developing, but about the scanning, about what I want the scan to look like.
You've just released a new photo book. It's called Notice.
Yes.
So I'd love to get to know. There it is.
And it's actually technically not out yet. I just picked up some copies from the printer, but it comes out in 2 weeks. But it's already available for order. So for all intents and purposes, it's out for people to get. It's
out. It's available to order, and we'll make sure to include links at the bottom so that you can order your own copy. Absolutely. I'm very excited to get my copy, of course. And why don't you share with us the journey or your journey to this book?
Well, it was not planned and it was not intentional. So what happened was I was in the middle of kind of traveling across the globe when, pre-pandemic and living in different cities for 3 months at a time. So like Tokyo and Buenos Aires and Berlin, and then got to Vancouver, Canada, and was supposed to be there for 3 months. But then about 1 month in, the whole country locked down because the pandemic happened. And I was kind of stuck in this, and I say stuck because I technically could have left, but going back to New York at that point in time was not a good idea, because that's when New York was kind of the worst part of it all. And so ended up being there in Vancouver for about 5 months and in a suburban neighborhood. And my general practice of photography is being in busy city centers, running around, noticing people, stopping them, having a chat, taking their portrait, writing their information down, and just kind of like getting to know a city that way. And of course, during the pandemic lockdown, everything was closed. No one was on the street. Plus I was in a suburb, which is not a place that I would have chosen for myself. But in hindsight, I'm very glad I was. But what happened was I had to flip everything upside down. Instead of running around a busy center of a city, I was now walking very slowly in a very quiet suburban area where there were no people on the street. And instead of taking portraits, I had to start looking at other things and kind of slow myself down. And it became a daily photo walk habit. It became kind of an anchoring meditation. While we were living in this unsure world, I wasn't sure, all my jobs got canceled. I couldn't really go anywhere. And this became kind of a daily routine for me to, same time of the day, same camera. I would just walk around, and I would walk about 2 to 3 hours a day and kind of like slow myself down and notice specific bits of beauty around myself that I would have usually run right past, because I was, focused on other things. I was focused on going fast and seeing people. And in this case, I had to just do the opposite. I had to slow down and look for beautiful little things that are typically maybe mundane, but actually super beautiful. And I discovered that this boring, quote unquote, suburb was actually just this like universe full of little bits of beauty. And I started photographing those bits of beauty. And then, like I said, it just started as a daily habit. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, oh, well, this is kind of interesting. My photography is kind of changing. This is an interesting approach. I enjoy it. And maybe I can make some prints, because like I said, my jobs were canceled. I was trying to like figure out another way of bringing income in with photography. So I was like, well, some of these are pretty good. Maybe I can make some prints. And then a couple of more weeks went by, and I was like, well, maybe it could be a zine. And then a couple of more weeks went by, and I was like, well, I wonder if I have enough for a book. That would be really cool. And I did 123 days like in a row of these walks, which ended up, because I track everything on my phone, it ended up being, more than 1,200 kilometers of walking just in that one neighborhood, which is for our American viewers, that's about 800 miles. And if you would have told me beforehand, like, oh, for your next project, you have to walk 1,200 kilometers in the same neighborhood, I would have probably been like, yeah, I don't think that's happening. But, like that's one of the main lessons for me from this project is like, if you do something every day, if you take small steps every day towards a certain goal, even if you don't necessarily know what that goal is beforehand, it really adds up. I could have never predicted that I would walk 1,200 kilometers in one neighborhood ever. But because I only did it one day at a time, 2 to 3 hours at a time, it just ended up compounding into this. And I made this body of work of about 35,000 photos. And that became this book. And what was interesting is I was talking to a friend at the time when I was close to the end of the shooting part of the book. And I was like, it's just kind of crazy because I'm I identify myself as a portrait photographer. And now I'm taking these I don't even know what to call it necessarily, like little still lives or something like the fine art. And he was like, yeah, but look at these photos. These are all portraits. They're just portraits of objects or little moments. And I was like, oh, you know what? That actually makes sense to me. So then it kind of like clicked, like how it relates to the rest of my work.
What's your mindset, if I can ask in this sense, what is your mindset to learning how to see, or how could others take from that, I guess, approach that you have and glean off it?
I think it's definitely unique to each person. So the way I see it's not how you see, it's not how anyone sees, but we all have our unique points of view, and they're all worthy and interesting. But I think we can all get better at seeing our own way. So practicing seeing and practicing noticing, not trying to see like other people, but just like honing in on what we notice, because you might notice something super beautiful and I'll see the photo and I'll be like, oh, I would have not approached it that way. I would have not seen that part. I would have maybe stepped 1 meter to the right and taking a picture of that other thing there. And that's so cool about photography, that it's our point of view in each photo. And I think it's really fun and worthwhile to try to develop our own point of view and just always be noticing things, always be practicing, even if we don't have our camera on us. So like if you're on the bus and you're going to another part of town and you should be, I think, taking mental pictures. You're like, "Ooh, that's a nice plot of light there," or "Oh, I like how that person is sitting on that motorcycle," or whatever it might be that you might notice. And to always be practicing that rather, I'm as guilty of it as anyone, like sitting there alone, but it's much better not to do that, or not to, do any of that kind of stuff. Just to practice our eye. If you're serious about photography, even as a hobby, which is totally just as good, then we have to realize that what we're doing is we're recording, we're documenting through our point of view. And if we practice it, like anything, it gets better.
Really, the only way to do what you just said to do and open our eyes to see and practice seeing means to switch off the distractions and typically, it's that's the great distraction.
Right? And that's what was also so nice about the meditative qualities of going for those daily photo walks in Vancouver. It was the one time of day where I could kind of turn off my brain, because the entirety of my brain was dedicated to seeing. And I wasn't thinking about anything. I was scanning. This is an old movie, but did you ever see the movie Predator back in the 90s?
Yes.
So it's an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, and it's an alien from another planet. And sometimes the movie shows us the scene from this alien's point of view, which is not how we see things. It's just kind of like a thermo, radar type of thing. And so you see him like scanning for, in his case, he scans for warmth, right? Because he's hunting for other beings. And so that's kind of like how I kind of imagine it when I'm walking. And when I'm doing a photo walk like that, I'm just always kind of scanning for light and darkness and objects and how they are shaped. Sometimes I don't actually see the thing that is there. I'm just looking at the shapes of the thing, because that's how I kind of compose my images. And that's kind of a fun, by doing that, I'm not thinking anymore. I'm registering, if that makes sense.
Something that's a skill that you've harnessed and I guess almost somewhat some could say mastered is that you in terms of photographing your environment, that a lot of what you photograph is strangers, right? What would you say to people who probably maybe a bit more timid or shy about the approaching to strangers, and any tips or advice for photographers?
Yeah, in the end, it's quite simple. I just wrote an entire issue of my newsletter, which is called Process, about how to approach strangers. And you can share that link if people want to see like the full thing. But in the end, what it comes down to, it's just you got to, it's a numbers game. You got to just do it a lot, and then it gets so much easier. Because I'm just like anyone, that it's a little bit. I can be shy, and it's a little bit scary to approach people. So if I haven't done it in a while, I might be nervous again. But if you're in the groove of just asking, then it actually gets way easier. And now it's never a problem for me. But that's also because I have the experience of doing it and it being cool. So it differs a little bit in terms of where you are culturally. For example, it's not that fun to ask strangers for a photo in Berlin, because the German people have a different relationship with privacy, and so they're mistrusting. Even legally speaking, you can't really do street photography in Berlin with faces in there, because there's some laws against that. So that's different. But like in New York, it's easy. Everybody wants to be in a photo. In Amsterdam, it's pretty easy too. In Tokyo, where you might expect people to be a little bit more shy, it's totally easy. So it's just a matter of approaching people with a smile on your face and kind of an open feeling, and just, whatever it is that I notice about someone is what I'll like. If I walked into you on the street and I'd be like, "Oh, I really like the hat hoodie combo. Like, I love the deep blacks here. Would it be okay if I take your photo? And then because I say it that way, which is what I mean, because I say what I mean, you, unless you're feeling crappy at that moment or whatever, you probably be like, okay, sure. And then, and then we take a photo, and then I'll end up sending it to you later, and then you might like it. And and that's really all it is. It's just an open approach with a friendly smile, and just that's the question. Can I take your photo? And then the question that people would maybe have in their head is why, but I've already answered that question by saying I really like your outfit or whatever it might be, or the light that's right here. So you almost never get a no. If you approach someone with a smile, and you also, I think if you're doing it with a cell phone, that's different. That might feel a little weird or creepy. But if you're walking around with a real camera, even if it's a small camera, then people will assume good intentions. They will assume, oh, you're an artist or a photographer or a student or whatever it might be. And so you almost never get a no. And when you do get a no, which happens, it's always a polite, kind of shy no. It'll be like, oh, it's okay. No, thank you. Like, it's like that. So it doesn't really feel that bad. So if you just do it a bunch of times, it'll get very comfortable, and you'll be able to handle the no's, and you'll notice that you almost get no no's. I've never gotten an angry no in all those years. And if you ask someone, that's also very different from if you're just taking the photo, right? Because that can feel weird. If I'm walking on the street and someone just goes like snap, like kind of like some of the classic street photographers in New York, and I love that work, but I could never do that, and I also wouldn't like it if it was done to me. So if you ask people and you're smiling and you have like a nice vibe about you, it's actually not that bad at all. It's actually quite fun. Plus, you get to meet interesting people. Most people are interesting in some way. There's this one young man, Justin, who I saw skating at a skate park in Manhattan, and he just had a really cool vibe, like great hair, just like a very kind of calm presence. And I actually didn't ask him to take photos. I just started taking photos of him because he's a skater and he was skating, and they're kind of used to it. And I made eye contact with him, so he knew I wasn't like creeping. And I took like half a roll of photos of him on a 35 millimeter, and then start talking to him and be like, hey man, I love the whole vibe. Here's my email. If you want to see the photos, let me know. And then he emailed me. And after that, he's been in the studio with me like 3 or 4 times, and we've done a bunch of shoots. And now he is kind of interested in becoming a model. And, you kind of get to really develop relationships that way, and friendships. Yeah. So, and it's also a great way to cast people, because, my bread and butter is doing commercial shoots for brands or magazines sometimes, but mostly brands. So if you're doing a campaign for a brand and they want a real person, I have an entire Rolodex of amazing real people that I already have a relationship with because I photographed them before. And it's cool to like meet someone on the street, and a year and a half later, they're in a commercial. I mean, that's cool.
So I put up on our Instagram or Shoot Film, just what do you want to ask Wesley? And a few people answered. I just took a couple of those questions. So first question by Ash Odara, and Ash said that what was Wesley's favorite and least favorite part of making Notice?
Good question, Ash. I would say being a photographer can be quite a solitary profession, or even as a hobby, really. And that's one of the things I love so much about the analog community, that it's so easy to meet nice people that have similar interests, right? And so one of my favorite parts about making a book is I can't make this book on my own. This is a very high-end product that involves so many crafts people of various kinds that do things that I can't do, and do them really well. And so this is a collaborative project. Dan Rubin designed it. Craig Mott wrote an essay for it. Jessica Hish designed a word mark for it. I did Zooms with probably 20 of my photography friends, including Willem, who you mentioned earlier, to go through my selections. And because after you shoot 35,000 images, it's very difficult to bring them down to 84 images and have a proper perspective still. So once I brought it down to about 300, I started setting up these Zoom calls with fellow photographer friends and going like doing a screen share and going through the images and kind of looking at the little screen of their face and what they reacted to. And that was really fun and a great way to curate the selection. So I think my favorite part was actually all of the collaborations with all of the wonderful people that were part of this project. And then I think my least favorite part was just the things that I couldn't control, like the things that we had to wait for. For example, due to the pandemic, there was a global paper shortage. I would have never anticipated that. So we were delayed by a month in our printing because there just wasn't any paper. And that was frustrating. But all in all, this has been an extremely positive experience for me. And I'm very proud of the project. And I'm very pleased with all the people who were part of it and how supportive my community has been and in ordering it. And so there's really not much negative about this. I think just like some of those little things that I couldn't control because I can be a little bit of a control freak.
At Hene asks, is there a future, or should I guess, to add on or iterate?
I like that just as a question. Is there a future?
Is there a future? Is there a future for film photography, or what does the future landscape for film photography look like, in your opinion?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I might be able to get very wealthy, but I don't. I hope that there is a future for film photography, and I do think there will be, but it's tough to say. I guess there's two things happening at the same time. We see, exciting young, fun companies coming up with new products like Negative Supply, who made that for scanning the little holders, film holders, and a light meter and other things like that. And then there's people who are putting out new film, even if it's repackaged like film from other places, whatever. It's cool to see people actually generating excitement and new products and ideas for the community. So in that sense, I feel like there's a real exciting current going on. On the other side, it's tough to see the large companies like Fuji and Kodak either raise their prices a lot, which I understand there's economic realities, but it makes it a lot less accessible, and even discontinuing some stocks like what Fuji did recently with the Pro 400H. And so I don't know. We'll have to see. I think there's certainly enough and a growing number of people who are very passionate about analog photography, and I wouldn't ever dissuade someone from starting it as a hobby or a goal profession because it might stop. Because I think I think in the end there will be something. I just hope that it's all of those things that we love about it. I would love for there to be a company who actually manufactures. This would be an incredible amount of money involved, but a new camera, like a new medium format camera, would be really cool.
It'd be amazing. There's definitely space for it. It's definitely demand for it.
Yeah, especially because all the other ones are getting really old and they break, and you can only repair them so long. And a lot of those. I also like that there's groups out there educating people on how to repair cameras or learning for themselves, because that's also very necessary, because all the old timers that have all that knowledge, they're getting quite old, and we don't want to lose that. We need the entrepreneurs with the technical background or the technical hunger to step up, and that would be amazing. But I agree. I think it's getting brighter and more popular, and I think that's a good thing. We just hope that the industry can keep up with that.
Lastly, Hannah Epiniet, I've probably butchered that name, but she asked, what advice do you have for a beginner shooting manual 35mm?
Number one, shoot as much as you can afford. And number two, use the technique of self-assigning stories to yourself or projects to do them, because I think it's very easy for any of us to take photos kind of randomly and then look at a magazine and be like, oh, I wish they would call me to do this fashion reportage or this newspaper or whatever. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that you can assign yourself these stories too. You don't have to wait for a magazine or a client to to do that. And then if you assign yourself these stories, let's say that this person wants to be a fashion photographer. Well, if they're just starting, no one's necessarily calling them, right? But that doesn't mean that she can't get together. I'm assuming it's she. I thought her name was maybe a she, but she can get together with her friends and do a fashion shoot, like use their own clothes, or maybe even know a local designer and be like, hey, I'm a photographer. This is my stuff. Can I do a shoot for you? You just supply the clothes. I supply the models, and it doesn't have to be paid in the beginning, and build up your portfolio that way. And if you put out these projects like a fashion shoot or a newspaper story or whatever it is, but you put it out yourself on the internet, or you make a zine or whatever it might be, you're going to get better and better at the thing that you want to do. And you're going to be noticed for the work you're putting out. You can't be noticed if you're not putting out stuff. And that's how you kind of can build up your own skill level specifically for the thing that you want to do within photography.
Sometimes we have blind spots in all walks of our endeavors of life. And I think something you said about your approach to the curation of your photo book, which was a beautiful thing, and I think requires a level of humility, and that is this. You put 20 photographers in front of you and you ask them, what do you like and what don't you like, in essence, right?
Right.
And I think to do that requires some level of humility, something that you've harnessed and something that you've taken on board. Yeah, I think that if someone's going to progress as a beginner in 35mm photography, shooting manual, and want to get better and want to have their work noticed, whether it's a curator like us with Shoot Film or anybody else out there, humility is a big part of that, right?
I think, what in the end, what do I know? What do you know? Like, we're also just doing our best and like honing our skills. So yeah, exactly. I think it's really important to show other people the work, and also not have an ego about it. Like if someone didn't like a photo that I really liked, that didn't crush me. It just meant like, oh, maybe there's, maybe it doesn't fit in this body of work, and I'll put it to the side for another time. And that's totally cool too. But I also want to say one thing, which is, I think, measuring your worth, whether it's as a person or as a photographer, based on social media is also quite a dangerous life to live in that sense, because the way it works on Instagram or really any social network that I know of is that it does kind of stimulate you to develop a certain sameness in your work, because you start off doing like a variety of styles as you're finding your visual voice. And then all of a sudden, like one hits a little harder for people on the internet. And it's very easy to get caught up in a cycle where that's all you're doing then. Like, oh, I guess now I do, neon portraits or whatever, like it doesn't matter what it is, but it's very easy to get caught up in that cycle of sameness where your work starts looking the same, not only compared to your work, but compared to a lot of other people online. So
it's like, who are you shooting for, right?
Yeah, you should be shooting for yourself, and unless it's a client job, then you're shooting for your client. But it's not so healthy to like you don't have to. You shouldn't measure it in likes, right? That's why I've turned those off. Just because like I've been in a situation where I sat with a friend who has way more followers even than I do. And we're talking hundreds of thousands. And they were so nervous about this photo that they were going to post, because I was like, oh, that's a really beautiful photo, because I was there when I took it. This was a digital photo. So I was just like there in the moment. And I was like, that's beautiful. You should post that. And he did. But then the next 15 minutes, all they were doing was like refresh to see how it did, because it was different from their other stuff. And so then when it didn't hit, I don't remember, 5,000 likes in the first 5 minutes, like he felt very anxious about it, and he wanted to delete it because it wasn't resonating with his audience. But that's kind of like, your audience shouldn't be determining what you do. You're supposed to show your audience what you're doing. I think that's a healthier way to approach these things. And you're never going to develop your voice. Like, just to go back to what we were saying earlier, everybody has their own perspective and their own way of looking at something that's unique. And to develop that, you can't let too many other especially strangers, into your decision-making process. When I was showing this body of work to my friends over Zoom, there was a very specific goal to it. I was culling. I was bringing it down to a publishable amount of photos, because I can't have a book with 3,000 photos, right? So there was a point to that. I wasn't subjecting each photo to a like or a not like. It was not about that. It was about like what feels like it resonates together. What is like, does this photo fit this body of work, or is it just a pretty photo, but it just doesn't really go with the rest? Mm-hmm. So sharing your work with others in that way, I think it can be very helpful and useful and healthy. But just putting it up as some sort of strange photographic hot or not, like binary choice, I think is tricky and not so healthy.
Before we go, I'd like to, shed some light on a couple of those projects that you're working on that you've either co-founded or are running yourself, and that is The Observers, and then also your newsletter, which is Process, right?
Yes. The Observers is a project that I co-founded with my dear friend Paul Jun, and that's kind of like our passion project about photo books. So we're both massive fans of photo books, and we felt one thing that was missing in the world of photography was a place where photo books were recommended to you, like specific ones in specific genres. Because other than like the like annual like best photo books of 2020 kind of list at the end of the year, we didn't really find many opportunities to be recommended books. Almost like I love an independent bookstore that you can go into and you see the little cards that the staff will write for, like, this is Joe's pick of the month or whatever, and this is Susan's favorite book that came out this week. That kind of stuff, I love that. And so what we wanted to create was a version of that where you have a trusted recommendation for a photo book. And we thought, well, who would we ask? Like, who would we like to most hear from about what their favorite photo books are? And so we ended up talking specifically to our favorite photographers, and that are mostly legends that are older and have been around. So, Elliot Erwitt, I had a conversation with him about his 5 favorite photo books and why. Bruce Davidson, all these, Kathy Ryan at the New York Times, all these people who have a steeped history in looking at photo books and just photography in general. And we asked them basically like, hey, you inspire us. Who inspires you? Like, what books inspired you in your journey? It could be a brand new photo book that inspired them this week, or it could be something from 30 years ago or 50 years ago even. And we just kind of like show which books that they mention, and then we interviewed them about what about each book is so special. And we're working right now on the 3rd season, because we do this in seasons. We did the first 2 seasons, and that's a total of, I think, 60 photographers so far. And they recommended a total of about 300 photo books. And some of them recommended the same photo book, which is also fun, because then when you go to the website and you click on certain books, you'll see quotes by multiple people, which is kind of fun to see, like why it appeals to both Elliot and Kathy, because those might be very different reasons. And we actually have one Australian guest on there as an interview, Yimi Yeo, who's a creative director. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a photographer, but he's mostly really a creative director. And he recently did like all the creative direction for Alicia Keys for her live performances, but also her like kind of branding around everything. And he's worked with a bunch of other interesting people. And he lives in Los Angeles, but he's from Australia.
And you've got also have a newsletter. It's called Process. When you tell us about that?
Process is it's my newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter, comes out every weekend. And it's about photography and finding your voice. So I just share some of my experiences in a kind of like educational and inspiring way, and also kind of like keep track of like the process of certain things that I'm doing. So the entire making of the book from the very beginning was also documented in the newsletter, so that people can see every step of the way, like how a book even gets made. For example, you might not realize that this is a hardcover and this is linen, but we went through 36 different kinds of linen until we found the exact right color and feel.
And it's yellow. if in case.
This is yellow, and then the special edition is red. You can't really see since we're in black and white, but these are specific yellows and reds, and it took a long time for us to find them because the yellow is matched with the marigolds that I photographed in Vancouver during this period, and the reds are matched with the poppies, like that came up later in the summer. And so all of these little choices, there's 1,000 choices that you might not realize go into a book, and be able to document and share those in the newsletter it's really fun. And there's all kinds of stuff in there, like how I take photo notes and how I work with a lab. That's the next upcoming issue where I talk to Carmencita, which is the lab in Spain, and we talk about like what's the best way to work with a lab, how can you communicate clearly with them, and all that kind of stuff. So it's just all about finding your voice and photography.
Great. Well, I highly recommend it if you want to, as Wesley said, learn more about his process behind the making of this photo book and some of his skill sets behind his photographic skills, and then also with observers and wanting to, I guess, get inspired by many photographers out there. That's an amazing resource for that. And I will link these below so that you can either order your copy of Notice, which is out in 2 weeks, and get inspired. Thank you so much for your time, Wesley. It's been an absolute privilege.